YouTube, it's Pastor Dwayne here. I have Dr. Peter Gurry and Dr. Maurice Robinson with us again. And this time I want to talk about Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So when I go through some of the apparatuses in our textual critical volumes, I see Aleph and B, right? And that's O1 and O3. Am I right? O1 and O3, GA O1 and O3 are referenced there always and tend to have significant weight to them. So what I wanted to do is bring these gentlemen on and ask them the question, why do we consider Vaticanus and Sinaiticus the most important manuscripts? Certainly there's more to it than just simply age. So Dr. Gurry, why is it that these are the most important manuscripts?
Yeah. Well, let's start with age and not dismiss that too quickly.
Yep.
Age may not be everything, and early manuscripts can be worse than later manuscripts, to be sure. However, having two nearly complete Bibles from the 4th century is pretty significant, right?
Right.
These are our two earliest nearly complete Bibles in existence. And let's be clear, there aren't many of those overall, okay? So by any metric, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus are very rare, and in that regard, special. Okay, some listeners may not like me calling them special at all, but they are.
Sure.
You cannot deny that. These things are huge manuscripts. They were labor-intensive productions, very expensive, and by pretty much any standard, they're very carefully produced. We can talk about the text, but just take them as physical objects, as books. They're extremely well made books. Okay, now I've never seen Vaticanus in person, but I'm told the vellum of Vaticanus is very carefully made. You have very few holes in it, for example. Okay, so this is like a deluxe manuscript, very expensive, well-made book, well-made Bible. Okay, so the age is significant, right? For certain books of the New Testament, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus may provide our first complete copy. Okay. So that's not nothing. We may have substantial copies, but there may be more fragmentary. Okay. So that's significant right there. Okay. What else do you want to know about it? What else do you want me to say? Sorry, I got lost.
Yeah. So the most the other thing that I've kind of heard, and I want to kind of pry that point just a little bit, noticing that it's put together really well. It's generally we didn't order this off of Temu, right? It was a bona fide craftsman putting this together. That speaks well to its quality as something that's put together. And does that transfer over to the quality of the text that it's been copied from? I guess that's really the question here.
So that's the big question. Is the text itself good? We can all agree the parchment is wonderful. The handwriting is terrific,
Yeah.
But if the handwriting is copying something that's not that great, well, maybe we can start by just giving some perspective, right? We should not conceive of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus as somehow being radically different than what's in our later Byzantine manuscripts. Okay, so Maurice has already talked about this in the other video we did with you. But Maurice, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said 94% is kind of the rough agreement between something like your Byzantine text and Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, right?
And the next, but basically.
Okay. So we'll take it as a rough comparison. It's not exact, obviously. But, I could pull up data from the ECM and show you agreement between, say, Vaticanus and certain Byzantine or at least medieval manuscripts and show that their percentage of agreement is well upwards of 90%. In some cases, 95, 96. Okay. That's really good. So on any metric, you should say the bulk of the text in Vaticanus and Sinaiticus is good. Do you know what I mean? We're not talking about Codex Beza here. Okay.
Right.
When you get to Codex Beza and compare it in the Book of Acts, say, its closest relative is an agreement of 60, 70%. It's just you have all these manuscripts that agree in these high rates of 80 to 90+%, and then all of a sudden there's just this huge gap, and then it's Codex Beza, right? But Beza just sort of falls off a cliff. All right. So if people want to find a manuscript that is really weird, okay, in comparison to the rest of the manuscripts that we have, Beza is the one you want to look at, not Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Okay. All right, now in terms of the text as a whole, is it good or bad? Well, people disagree, obviously. I tend to think that the text in Vaticanus in particular is probably the best, textually speaking, it's probably the best single manuscript we have of the New Testament. Okay, and that doesn't mean it's equally good everywhere. It's going to vary slightly, maybe from book to book. But certainly as a whole, my opinion is that if I had to go into a desert island, okay, and I could only take one Greek manuscript with me, I would take Vaticanus. Now, my only hesitation with that would be it is missing some books today, like it doesn't have Revelation.
Right.
So I'd have a little bit of a tricky decision to make, because do I want to lose those books? Probably not. Okay, but let's say I could supplement those books with another manuscript. The main manuscript I'd want to have on a desert island would be Codex Vaticanus. All right, now you probably want to ask me why, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, why Vaticanus?
Okay. I just don't want to keep rambling. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
So it's pretty simple. Okay. When I go through the New Testament and pay attention to my apparatus and make kind of, let's call them textual decisions on the fly as I'm reading. Okay. So I'm not saying, like, I'm not stopping and doing 2 hours of work on a particular variant, but I'm just looking at the variant and going, oh, what's kind of my initial reaction to explain the variants here? I find that again and again, Vaticanus proves itself to have the reading that I would pick if I didn't know what any of the manuscripts involved were. In other words, based just on internal evidence, I would look at the readings and go, I think this reading probably explains the other ones. And more often than not, the manuscript that turns out to have that reading is Vaticanus. So
Okay,
that's my basic reason.
So now in talking about what we were talking about before with text types, does that change anything as far as your opinion or the general consensus on the text of Alexandrinus, the text of Sinaiticus or Vaticanus? Yeah.
For me personally, or for other people?
Yeah, just generally. Does that change anything generally?
Like for other people, do you mean? Because for me, no, it doesn't do anything. I don't care. As we talked about, text types don't really do much for me. So I don't.
Oh, okay.
I don't care.
See.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't care what text type you call it. I don't think Vaticanus is important because it's part of the Alexandrian text type. That doesn't matter to me at all.
Okay, I see. Gotcha.
Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yep, that makes sense. No, that's great. That's fine. So let's turn our my first coffee is wearing off. Yeah. Let's turn our attention to geography. So I was a King James version guy, right? When I was first a Christian, I was in KJVO land, and you're aware of the two-stream argument in Alexandria and Antioch, right? It's typically said that Alexandrian manuscripts come from Egypt, hence Alexandria, right? Alexandria, Egypt.
Yeah.
So Dan Wallace on a little video coming from Zondervan suggests that Vaticanus, I think it's Vaticanus. Now I conflate the two, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, but I think he's talking about specifically Vatican, one or the other. Says they're from Egypt. So my thinking here in talking about these manuscripts coming from Egypt, which my understanding is there's a potential that could be the case, and if it is, does this mean that the text represented inside Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which is a little closer to those in the papyrus, represent an Egyptian text as opposed to the original text?
Yeah. Well, okay, that second part is
as
opposed to the original text.
Yeah.
I don't know why we should think that an Egyptian text can't represent the original text. It's
Right.
not like when a manuscript gets taken to Egypt, suddenly it becomes bad when it crosses a border.
Right.
Ancient or modern. But let's go back to the question, should we think of these manuscripts as Egyptian in some way? I haven't watched the video that you mentioned, so I hesitate to comment on that. There's kind of there is an argument to be made that Alexandria, Egypt is known to have this famous library in the ancient world, and that there is, like, we know of careful Homeric scholarship happening in Alexandria, Egypt. We think of something like the Aristarchian symbols that come from there. And so you can document from the ancient world like a scholarly community that's working on texts in Alexandria. I think that's probably fair. And so I think it's natural for people to look at a manuscript like Vaticanus and think, this looks like a very carefully made book. All right. It's a very carefully copied text. And so it would make sense if it comes from a place that we know people are doing scholarly work on texts.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Other Greek texts like Homer. Okay. So there's something to be said for that. And then also, I think traditionally the text, the reason the Alexandrian text type, I think, and Maurice can correct me if this is wrong, but why it's been called that is because Origen, before he moves, okay, he does move away from Alexandria, but he starts his academic career in Alexandria, Egypt. And if you can show that, in his works, he tends to quote texts similar to Vaticanus and Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, then you can make the case that, okay, we know Origen lived in Alexandria, and if he shares readings in common with these two manuscripts, then we can tie those manuscripts to the same locale. Does that make sense?
Right.
Now, I'm not making that argument myself, but I think that's probably the argument people have traditionally made. Is that right, Maurice? Do you want to jump in on this and correct me?
Well, some people have made that argument, and we're talking about people that are not pro-Byzantine, just to make that clear. From my perspective, I would say that the reason I would call this an Alexandrian text or Alexandrian cluster, whichever you want to call it, is primarily the fact that you've got the Egyptian Coptic versions, the Sahidic, the Bohairic, the Fayumic, and that, which are so heavily tied and parallel to the text of Vaticanus or Sinaiticus that it seems like, and James D. Price had suggested this, that the Greek text may have actually been the basis, the Alexandrian type Greek text, the basis for translation into the Coptic version, because the Coptic version is, without question, so heavily Alexandrian. I don't think you have to bring in Origen as an originator of the text or anything like that. He may have promulgated it, he used it, we know that, but I think really the Alexandrian text could be the product of Alexandrian textual scholarship, like you were talking about, and that it then could serve as the basis for the translation into Coptic. So I do think that the Egyptian provenance is very likely in that case.
Yeah, and so this kind of brings me to a thought that I have just been kind of thinking about a little bit recently. So if we and this kind of goes with the question of undue weight given to Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. If we have Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and then we have the Egyptian papyri, which are geographically, and now I'm making the assumption for the sake of the argument for Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, that just assuming they're Egyptian. Do we have enough manuscripts, or is the sample size big enough to suggest that what we see in Egypt is also what we see in the rest of the Roman Empire, or the rest of the world in that area? Peter?
Okay, so this is kind of the question of like, should we think that the papyri that we have in the New Testament, they're all just representing a text that was in Egypt, and they don't represent anything beyond that? I've always been skeptical of this idea, mainly because I think we know that books make their way around the Roman Empire just fine. And so I don't know, the idea that somehow, I find it plausible to think that, certain type of text might promulgate itself in a particular region more than in other regions. Yes.
Right.
But these aren't like, it's not like there were tariffs on Egyptian manuscripts in Rome, where if a Christian was, coming from Alexandria, moving to Rome and brought a copy of the Gospels with them, that Roman officials said, no, you can't bring that here because that's from Egypt. Do you know what I mean? So texts move just as much as people did. In fact, people are pretty much the only way that texts move, right? They don't have legs. So anywhere people can go, manuscripts can go with them. And I just can't think of any reason to think that texts would have been so geographically isolated. Might they have predominated? Sure. But I don't know how to prove that one way or the other. I don't think we have enough evidence to be able to do that. And two, I think it's absurd to think that somehow they didn't spread. Do I know what the text looked like in Antioch in the 3rd century? I don't.
No, yeah.
Do I know that there were no manuscripts from Egypt there? I do not know that. Do I know that there were some scholars in the early church, like a Jerome, like an Origen, who had the wherewithal to compare texts and prefer one over another? Yes. So is it plausible that somebody like Origen could have had a set of manuscripts in Alexandria and he chose his favorite ones to take with him when he moves? yes. But again, I don't know which ones he took necessarily, and none of that means that somehow he had enough influence to change all the manuscripts that were in Rome or something like that. So my own view is that I think trying to isolate particular, what we call text types, to geographical locations is probably a dead end. And so thinking that there's something like an Egyptian text type, okay, that is somehow limited to Egypt, I think is probably not a helpful way to think about it. Now, versions are a little bit different story.
Yeah.
Because versions are isolated by language, and so there's not as much, well, they just might not spread as much. So there's no reason for somebody to be reading Syriac in Gaul in the 2nd century, as far as I can tell. But even there, I would add that we know that somebody like Thomas of Harkle, who translates, he makes a fresh revision of the Syriac New Testament in the early 7th century. We know that he actually does it in Egypt, not in Syria. We know he's in a place called Enaton, which is near Alexandria. Okay, so there's a clear case where a new Syriac translation is being made in a place where there probably aren't, I mean, there's enough Syriac speakers for him to go there, to move there, presumably, but Syriac is not the dominant language of Alexandria, Egypt in the 7th century, early 7th century. So that's a clear case where even these, where we might want to limit a translation, an early translation like Syriac, to just the region of Syria, even that we actually know, no, you've got a new Syriac translation happening in Egypt in the early 7th century. Does that make sense? So I don't want to draw too many conclusions from that, other than just to say we should be careful not to treat either these early translations or particular types of manuscripts like the papyri as if they are geographically hermetically sealed.
Right.
I think that's a bad way to think about it.
Yeah, because I think, it's difficult too, because we have this plethora of papyrus manuscripts, which are early, which, the desert climate in Egypt, if we've heard all these arguments before, tend to favor the preservation of those. And in order to prove any sort of assumption beyond a doubt, we would have to have early representatives found in other places. We just don't have it. So we're making assumptions at this point.
Yeah. And even the idea that somehow you only find so-called Alexandrian texts in Egypt. I mean, P72 is a witness that is pretty unusual in certain ways, and it doesn't agree at a very high rate with, say, Vaticanus or Sinaiticus. I could find you Byzantine manuscripts that agree with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus much more than P72 does, but P72 is a papyrus. So which manuscript of, say, 2nd Peter is representative of Egypt, P72 or Vaticanus?
Right.
And how would you pick? I don't know.
Okay, Dr. Robinson, what are your thoughts on the geographic argument for an Egyptian text?
Well, I think there are reasons why you can consider there to be a localized Egyptian text. What I said before about the Coptic versions, the Coptic versions are not spreading elsewhere in the empire. So they apparently came from a text similar to that of either Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, P66, P75. Something was in there that relates to it, but I think they're closer probably to Vaticanus than anything else. Sinaiticus has a lot of scribal errors in it, much more than Vaticanus. I think Kurt Aland said, I don't remember what year, but he said you need to pay a lot of attention to Egyptian religion in theology, and the Coptic Church was separate from the Greek Orthodox Church, and they were basically totally at odds with each other. And I think because of that, it would keep the spread of manuscripts produced in Egypt, mainly just by guilt from association, from making headway into the area where the Greek Orthodox were predominant. So it is possible that the text is produced in Egypt, maybe by the Alexandrian scholars that are there at the Alexandrian library, but that it would not have a great deal of travel or prominence elsewhere outside of Egypt because of guilt by association with the doctrinal views that differed from Greek Orthodoxy, which otherwise would have been predominant in the Eastern Empire. So I do think, yes, you can still hold to it being a more localized text of Egypt, but again, not to forget that 94% where we're talking about
Mhm.
identity of text. It's still only in a small amount. And if we go back to the desert island analogy, I believe the professor on Gilligan's Island may well have had a copy of Vaticanus.
Mhm.
And they didn't hurt him, except it kept him from finding a way to get off the island.
That's funny. All right. Last question here. So, what would you say to those? I guess probably more directed toward you, Peter, myself included here. Okay. I've started this kind of series of videos where I'm kind of going through the textual variants that include an entire verse from the King James Version and looking at it from a Byzantine perspective. And what I've noticed, I think I've done about 4 or 5 so far. And of the 4 or 5 that I've done, it's very clear that Aleph and B tend to push the decision over the edge here. So we would suggest that there's still a lot of weight, I would say undue weight, given to Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. What would you say to the charge that there's too much weight on the 2 manuscripts when making decisions?
If we're talking about past scholars like Westcott and Hort, I would say yes. If we're talking about maybe say like the Nestle-Aland 27, yes, I think I'm happy with the criticism of it that says there's too many times where they follow Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and there's a simpler explanation for the for how what you find in Sinaiticus and Vaticanus is actually just a mistake. I mean, we talked about Mark 11, what was it, 26?
Yeah.
Right. There's one where I think, yeah, that's a good example. I mean, I'm on record defending a reading in Ephesians 5:22 that is not found in Vaticanus and arguing against Vaticanus and P46 at precisely that point. And I argue that it's partly because of undue weight given to those 2 manuscripts. I've also written an article advocating for preferring the longer reading when the shorter reading can be explained by homoiotoluton, even if that shorter reading is found in good old manuscripts like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So the way I would say it is something like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are very good manuscripts. And in the case of Vaticanus, probably our single best manuscript overall. But no single manuscript and no group of manuscripts is always right. And here's where I would disagree with my friend Maurice Robinson. I think I apply that even to something like the Byzantine text. As I said, no manuscript, no group of manuscripts is always right. All scribes made mistakes, and all of our manuscripts have scribal mistakes in them. I'm not talking about theological mistakes. I'm talking about scribal mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So I'm never afraid to say, you know what? I think in this case, the internal evidence is so strong that even though I think Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are overall really, really good manuscripts, some of our best, they're wrong here. And that's totally fine, you know? So I have no problem believing that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are wrong.
Right.
They're not perfect manuscripts. And then, yes, with that, I would say, yes, I'm comfortable saying there's probably been too much emphasis on their agreements from folks in my camp, in the Reason Eclectic camp. And, you know, we could put some of the blame here at the feet of Westcott and Hort. You know, my only defense of them would be, and I think it's important to treat people who are dead as fairly as we can. Someday we will be dead, and we will hope people treat
That's
us
right.
fairly, right? So I think Westcott and Hort were totally understandably really impressed with these 2 manuscripts because they were brand new to people. And they are extremely impressive manuscripts. And frankly, the discovery of the papyri has, I think, vindicated their overall judgment of the importance of these 2 manuscripts. But I do think that led to a tendency to treat them as sort of sacrosanct sometimes.
Right.
And I think
right.
Tischendorf probably did the same thing. Tischendorf actually, it's funny because Tischendorf put more weight on Sinaiticus, Westcott and Hort put more on Vaticanus.
Right.
And with somebody like Tischendorf, it's totally understandable. The guy discovered the manuscript, right?
It's the Shiney-New syndrome.
Yeah. And as my supervisor once told me very memorably, said, Peter, you're always tempted to give more weight to evidence that you're the one that found it.
Right.
And I think that's true. We all do that, right? So Westcott and Hort and Tischendorf, they're all human beings. We are as well. Someday people will look back on us and say, gosh, how are they so blinded by this? Well, I want to say I think I can understand why Westcott and Hort and Tischendorf were a little bit blinded and gave a little too much weight to these manuscripts. I think it's understandable. Does it mean we should follow them? No, we can be happy to say, a little too much. Let's not give so much weight to these ones and think that they're always right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in general terms, the way you stated it, yes, I'm happy to say that there's been a little too much weight given to agreements between those two. However, where I would differ from like my friend Maurice is I still think, even saying that, even with that caveat, I still think they come out as very good manuscripts, two of our best. And in the case of Vaticanus, overall, probably our best.
All right. And Dr. Robinson, what are your thoughts on the overarching use of those two manuscripts?
Well, you know that Westcott and Hort were looking specifically at the agreements of Aleph and B. And on those agreements, this is where, again, I would use my clustering idea of text types, that it shows they go back to an early archetype. Now, they may have come to some of their agreements by just pure chance, but more than likely, since neither one was copied from the other, they are going back to a common archetype. And then you have P75 that reads very much like Vaticanus, but it's not the archetype of Vaticanus either. So we're talking about something probably in the 2nd century that was the archetype for this Alexandrian type of text. But other than that, like we said, if 94% of the text is there and you're on a desert island with only that text, you'll probably do reasonably well enough. And it's what I said in the first edition of the Robinson-Pierpont Greek New Testament, that the Alexandrian text is not a bad text. The problem is mostly in the study of details, where there would be differences from the Byzantine.
Right.
Now, if I had to pick what my own favorite text would be, again, not one single manuscript, but I would take a consensus from the Byzantine manuscripts, the uncials even. If I had to limit it down, just say, what is the consensus of, say, E, F, G, H, K, S, M, U, V, omega? If I could take a consensus just of that, I would have a text that is so close to the full Byzantine text as edited, I'd be content with that. And I'd be in that last 6% where the Aleph B text differs. I would be more content with this consensus, because that would raise me up to a point of about 98.5%, where I would be much more comfortable than with 94%. So as important as Aleph and B are, I would not personally use them as primary, but I would not deprecate them and say that these are the worst possible manuscripts. I think Bergen went way overboard when he condemned them on those grounds. But and Hoskier too, when he pointed out there's 3,000 differences between Aleph and B. Well, yeah, but Hoskier was even counting spelling variations. And it's not where they differ, because usually when Aleph and B differ from each other, one of them agrees with the Byzantine and the other one doesn't. So I'm just looking at where they agree, and that usually will differ from what the Byzantine has, because they're going back to some sort of Alexandrian archetype. So again, they're not going to be evil texts, but they're not going to be as good as what I would see in the Byzantine consensus.
All right. Well, Dr. Peter Gurry and Dr. Maurice Robinson, thank you so much for your time again. I'm hoping we can do something like this again in the future. I have many more questions and many more things to talk about. But you've been so gracious with your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Dwayne.
All right, brothers and sisters, until next time, we'll see you around.